Hello and welcome to All 24 News, special coverage on Russia-Ukraine file coming to you live from Algiers. The Russian special military operation in Ukraine is said that it has destroyed several Ukrainian cities, caused a humanitarian crisis and fueled insecurity around the world. The West says Russia is still moving its forces to Ukraine's eastern border in the south, and the Russian military appeared close to capturing Mariupol, a win that would allow Moscow to establish a land bridge between Russia and the occupied territory of Crimea. So, what is the aim of the Kremlin, and how will this war end? Such questions and more are raised in this tense situation and to our panel of guests who will answer some of these questions through their analysis of the conflict. We have via Skype James Dorsey, a geopolitical analyst and a senior fellow at Middle East Institute NUS from Singapore, along with Federica Setu-Gallo, international relations and diplomacy analyst from France. Thank you both gentlemen for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into any discussion, let's start with this info. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in an evening video address, says the war would be much shorter if they received the necessary weapons.
The faster and in greater quantity we receive the weapons we have asked for, the stronger our position will be and the faster peace will come.
I shall commence by you, Mr. James Dorsey. What is your general analysis of this war? Why is Zelensky emphasizing on receiving military aid? I mean, more military aid. Is he looking for some heavy weaponry? And is this really going to turn the tide?
Well, clearly he's looking for heavy weaponry. Fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians, the military, as well as the paramilitary forces, have performed far better than anyone would have expected. Far better than Vladimir Putin had expected. It's clear that Putin had assumed that he would have a sort of blitzkrieg. This has been going on now for a very long time. The Russians have suffered serious casualties, both in terms of lives as well as in terms of equipment. And therefore, the confidence of Zelensky that the more weaponry they have and the heavier weaponry they have, the quicker they will be able to end this war. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen. Putin has, for all practical purposes, boxed himself into a corner. He needs to have something that he can show as a victory, and he wants to have that before May 9, when they have a national celebration.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Federica Setu-Gallo? How do you analyze the situation on the ground right now? Do you believe the West and their allies, or its allies, providing more weapons will urge Russia to withdraw?
Yes, thank you, Karim, for the invitation. I do agree with what James is saying in terms of the request made by President Zelensky. I mean, if you look at this week with all the events that have been unfolding, especially with the sinking of Moskva, within the Black Sea, we have to understand the objectives that President Putin is trying to achieve here, especially in the geopolitical field of the Black Sea. Being able to capture Mariupol is obviously going to enhance his objectives of connecting the Donbas region as well as the port there. So again, with Zelensky, requesting for additional international aid, well, if we look at Ukraine versus Russia on its own, Ukraine independently cannot defeat Russia. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so Ukraine is relying solely on international aid, and hence why I feel that the West is definitely putting their hand up and supporting Ukraine in this instance. And further to what James was saying as well, I believe that President Putin has actually underestimated the resilience of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. And not to mention, the amount of volunteers that have gone over to Ukraine to help in this invasion or fight against the invasion, coupled with the military assistance that is required, it's definitely justifiable. And without it, it's hard to see an end to it. I believe that if Russia withdraws, I think there's only one reason Russia will withdraw: if NATO does not expand eastward. And I think we can talk about the nuances about that later in the conversation. But I think the request of Zelensky to obtain international aid via military equipment is definitely justified.
Very well indeed. Now, in a related news, Russia sent an official diplomatic note to the United States and NATO regarding shipments of the most sensitive weapon systems, saying that they add fuel to the fire in the conflict. In what appeared to be veiled threat, the Russian memo said continued arms shipments to Ukraine would lead to unpredictable consequences. Back to you, Mr. James Dorsey. What are these consequences Kremlin is talking about? It's obvious that this military aid is rubbing Russia the wrong way, right?
Obviously, let me start off with, if my colleague will allow me to refine slightly what he said. Mm-hmm. Fact of the matter is, the Ukrainians need the hardware. They're doing the fighting themselves, and they've excelled in the fighting themselves. So what they're asking is basically to be given the means to carry out this fight. What we've seen throughout this conflict is basically what I would consider a very dangerous situation that's being emphasized by the note that the Russians have sent to the United States. And that is that the Russians essentially have used nuclear blackmail to try and keep NATO out of the war in terms of direct participation, where it be through a no-fly zone or whatever other military intervention they would contemplate. That is, again, what's happening here. What Putin is telling the Americans, this can escalate, and I have not ruled out nuclear conflict if you continue to support Ukraine with military hardware. That creates a very dangerous situation, because if you give in to nuclear blackmail today to Russia, what do you do if that kind of blackmail is used by other nuclear powers?
Mm-hmm. So
Putin's problem is that if he's having already the difficulties having in fighting the Ukrainian military, he can't afford a conflict with NATO itself, and therefore nuclear blackmail is really his only option.
Mm, very clear indeed. Let me address this question to you, Mr. Federica Setugalo. Do you think this war is going to linger on further still? What way out do you see out of this?
Well, I think one critical point I would like to highlight and draw your attention to is actually the ideology, or the political ideology that President Putin has. I mean, we need to understand that every decision, every strategy that is made is underpinned by this ideology. And I guess, it goes without saying that he's a former KGB member. I mean, he once stated that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. So every move he makes is generated from this foundation. And so there is the belief that he wants to resurrect the Soviet Union, or at least, resurrect the Russian Federation. And so from this standpoint, if he draws back, for whatever reason he draws back, I believe that he's going to be reassessing, re-strategizing, and then he will recommit back into Ukraine. And in terms of how do I see an ending to this, well, I alluded to it earlier. If he's made several requests in the past about, requesting to NATO to stop expanding eastward. And I think, in all honesty, if we go with a diplomatic solution, there is no ultimate winner in this case. So if NATO is to stop expanding, then Russia is to withdraw immediately and stop invading Ukraine. And so in this instance, I guess I just wanted to remind our viewers that the ideology is important because that is what is going to constantly drive Putin to achieve his objectives and achieve the goals that he has in mind. And so the only way out, if NATO actually comes to the table and have these discussions, because that's the reality of it at this point.
Very nice. The European Union on Friday denounced the unjustified expulsion of 18 diplomats from its representation in Russia and deplored in a press release a pure measure of retaliation after a similar measure taken by Brussels following the Kremlin offensive in Ukraine. The EU statement said that the diplomats in question performed their duties within the framework of and in full respect of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Still with you, Mr. Federica Settigallo. How do you see this retaliatory move by Russia? Is it justified since Russia is being demonized by the West, while the West's flaws and atrocities are forgotten or turned a blind eye to? How do you see this?
Well, I think it should not come as a surprise, the action that Putin has taken. I mean, the West has imposed heavy sanctions on Russia. And so, by removing the 18 diplomats, I think this also actually gives an indication of President Putin's mindset in terms of, releasing these diplomats. If this is the case, perhaps, Putin sees no option in terms of a diplomatic option. And so, to me, this is quite concerning because if he is removing these diplomats from Russia, then I guess the only option or the only tools at his disposal at this point is probably military. And at this stage, it's quite concerning that he's removing these diplomats because in the perfect world, we would like to resolve this diplomatically, and diplomatically means the US needs to be at the table, the EU needs to be at the table, and also NATO needs to be at the table in order to resolve this. But if this is the action that Putin has taken, then perhaps we need to be thinking outside the square. Now, in terms of his retaliation, in terms of West in general, well, I guess there are a few different school of thoughts in relation to how the West has acted in the past, and whether it's justified or not. And so I think what also underlines Putin's reaction in this regard is the fact that he is still trying to resist or minimize the West-led order in the multipolar world that we live in. It's no longer the world of superpowers between Russia and America, but the reality is we're in a multipolar world, and although that is the case, Russia still believes that America is still trying to be number one on top of that pecking order.
Very nice. What about you, Mr. James Dulcie? Do you agree with our distinguished guest's analysis? Is there anything else you would like to add? How far do you think diplomacy is going to fail?
Let me divide this into two things. I want to pick up on something that Federica said. I think it's very right, and it's important to look at ideology. I would take that a step further, though. Putin's ideology is not simply to prevent the expansion of NATO or to resurrect the Soviet Union. He's been very clear about what his ideology is. Putin is one of a number of very powerful world leaders who think in civilizational terms rather than in national terms. So they look at the borders of their country in civilizational terms rather than national terms. Putin has made that very clear, defining it as the Russian world, which is a world whose borders are defined by places where you have Russian speakers or those who adhere to Russian culture. And that's what we're seeing. And what that basically means is they think of a world in which international law no longer is applicable, the rule of law is no longer applicable, and it becomes might is right. Now, what that means in terms of resolving the conflict, frankly, I don't see a negotiated solution at this point. Countries, people who have conflicts with one another, only compromise and agree to truly negotiate, not just sit at the table, when the price of doing so becomes too high. It has not become too high. either for Russia at this point or for the Ukraine. And for Ukraine, it's almost impossible for them to accept Russian demands, which would be neutrality, essentially demilitarization, or recognition of independence of parts of their own country. And by the same token, unless Putin can achieve something which he can present as a real achievement of this conflict and worth the price that Russia has paid, a negotiated solution for him will not solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. And what further compromises can Ukraine still make?
Well, I think that they can make the compromises that they've already offered in terms of neutrality. But then again, Russia and Ukraine define the term neutrality very different. And there is no meeting of the minds on that. But that I don't see how they can go much further than that, nor do I see why they should.
Very nice indeed. Let me share with you this. German Finance Minister Christian Lindner has confirmed that Berlin will boost its military assistance spending in 2022 to 2 billion euros. The increase in the budget will be dedicated for global military assistance, with reports suggesting more than 1 billion euros will be kept for Ukraine. Germany has supplied Ukraine with military supplies, including grenades, anti-aircraft rockets, machine guns, and ammunition, but not heavy weapons. Mr. James Dorsey, I get back to you. Are we about to enter a phase of a proxy war now? Is Ukraine going to be the battlefield between the West and Russia? Do you expect a direct clash between Russia and NATO power soon?
First of all, it already is a battlefield between the West, or let's say the United States and Europe, and Russia. It's a battlefield of Russia's making, not of the European and the US's making. That's not to say that they haven't taken all kinds of steps which the Russians may or may not have perceived as provocative. But at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin is responsible for his own decisions. What I think Putin has done, and many have commented on this, he has achieved exactly what he did not want to achieve and what the Europeans and the Americans until now have not been able to achieve. That is greater unity, a greater agreement on military spending, and what you were quoting about Germany. That is a paradigm shift in German policy since World War II, and that would not have happened without the intervention in Ukraine. So fundamentally, in a sense, despite all its flaws and contradictions, it's Putin who has enabled the United States and Europe to move forward on this.
Very nice. Mr. Federica Setugalo, why do you think Germany is boosting its military assistance spending? Are we preparing for a major war now?
Yes, so just to also add to what my colleague James was saying in terms of, the unity that Europe and America has demonstrated, and I think, to the point that I alluded to earlier, excuse me, President Putin had underestimated the unity that Europe had generated as well as the United States. So in this sense, I think I believe the aid that Germany is spending in terms of its military, I think that has somehow to do or connected with the energy sector. Okay, we all know that Europe, relies heavily on Russia, for around 35 to 40% of its natural gas. Now, if you look at the specific projects that's happening in that space, we're looking at the Nord Stream 2 project, and this has been very controversial, has been very difficult to navigate, because even prior to the developments of this project, it has, the Americans have obviously been involved in the details, and obviously trying to perhaps minimize the geopolitical expansion of Russia as well. And so, because of this, there are implications. This includes increasing the imports from other countries. Obviously, Germany and Europe as a whole is now in a position to be able to diversify its energy mix and look at other options other than Russia. And what this means is that they'll be importing, liquefied natural gas from the US, from Algeria, and from Japan. And so you cannot make these kind of drastic moves without Russia retaliating at the same time, because within the scope as well, Germany had suspended the Nord Stream 2 project. It also suspended its certification, by the German specialists. And so if we're making drastic decisions like this, because a lot of money has poured into this project, a lot of private investors have poured into this project. Now, if we're suspending this project, then there is going to be a retaliation from President Putin and Russia. And so in this case, Germany is obviously, spending a lot more on their military, on the defence, and I think this is probably an indication of the entirety of Europe. Looking at the current invasion, we have to do something. That this is the reality of it, and so. There are other solutions in terms of getting gas, but I think things will be getting much more worse before it slightly gets better.
But don't you think that Europe is not really ready to replace its energy products by Russia, or Russian energy products by the ones coming from the Middle East or from North Africa, since it's costly? They cannot afford it with the same price, that's one. And secondly, it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be that immediate, since Europe mainly was investing in green and renewable energy. How do you see that?
And yes, Karim, you've hit it on the mark. That is the reality of it. We cannot achieve this overnight. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Europe had already been exploring, the different options in relation to renewable energy. I mean, there was even exploring, again, the nuclear and utilizing that to its full potential. But again, it's one of those projects and one of those drastic moves that need to be made over a period of time. And I know there's been discussion amongst the leaders in terms of looking at the end of 2022 to at least start reducing the import of gas from Russia. So I want to highlight there it's actually reducing and not eliminating completely. Just as you've already highlighted, Karim, that is the reality. It's not going to be an overnight success, but it's going to be something that's going to be carried out through a significant amount of time.
Yes, very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. James Dulcie? Do you agree with our distinguished guest analysis? And how do you see the pressure card that Russia has, which is energy?
Essentially, you've got two pressures going on. Mm-hmm. One pressure is the realization and the acceptance that Europe has to move away from dependency on Russian energy. And so what we're talking about, how long will that take, rather whether one should do it and how do you do it. That's one part of it. On the other hand, I think you've also got to keep in mind that Europe looks at what's happening in Ukraine to a certain degree as an existential issue. So if indeed Russia gets away with invading a country, depriving it of its sovereignty and subjugating it to its own whims, very much analog to what Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates tried to do with non-military means with Qatar, then you are basically giving up on international law, on the rule of law.
And in that case, are we expecting a new world order if we have these countries that are not respecting the law?
I can just complete what I wanted to say.
Yes.
The dynamic of a transition in the world order from a unipolar world to what would have possibly been a multipolar world, but now is probably going to be a bipolar world, since Russia effectively has taken itself out of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, we can also raise the question of the alliance that Russia and its eastern countries are doing. So, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham, who has a delegation visiting Taiwan, said China must pay a higher price for supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as Mr. Graham described it.
We're going to start making China pay a greater price for what they're doing all over the world. The support for Putin must come with a price.
Mr. James Dulcie, Russia's traditional allies walk on a tight rope right now between security and concerns and economic interests after Moscow's all-out war on Ukraine. Now, after Russia, we see that the West is targeting their allies. Do you think the Eastern Alliance can stand against the West?
I'm not quite sure what we define as the Eastern Alliance, and I'm not quite sure what we define as traditional allies. I think what we're seeing is China is looking at this very carefully, clearly, and China is in a bind. China is looking at it very carefully because it is looking at what would happen if indeed China would try with Taiwan what Russia is trying with Ukraine and how that plays out. That's one part of the equation. The other part of this equation is that Russia is violating every principle of Chinese foreign and defense policy. And for China, this is a balancing act. On the one hand, it wants to maintain the relationship with Russia, all the more so now that Russia will definitely become the much weaker party in that relationship. But it wants to maintain that relationship primarily because it strengthens its position versus the United States. But on the other hand, how China deals with this and with its continued emphasis on rule of law and on upholding international law, I think the longer this takes, the more difficult it will get for China.
Indeed. Mr. Federica Situ-Gallo, is Russia showing its position to the world as a world power? Or is Russia a real world power? Or like some analysts described it, a void world power due to the different economic blows this country is witnessing?
Yes, well, I think Russia is still trying to enforce itself as one of the major world powers in the world. And just to highlight what my colleague James was saying in terms of the China and Russian involvement or relationship. I mean, one point I'd like to highlight is the fact that whilst we're talking about the West, resisting Russia and its allies, we have to remember that when there was a United Nations General Assembly voting to suspend Russia's membership on the Human Rights Council, there were only 93 in favor. Whilst there were 93 in favor, there was also 24 countries that voted against it. And also, what I'd like to highlight is that there were 58 abstentions in their voting system. So again, even though the West can implement all the different sanctions and all the different strategies, etc., to minimize Russia's aggression. The concerning aspect for me is that there are still 24 countries that voted against this resolution, and there are 58 abstentions. So, for me, I believe that even from an energy perspective, from a military perspective, or the economic as well, Russia also has. It just means that the markets are open elsewhere, And if we we can look towards Africa as an example, where both China and Russia are heavily present in the different countries. That is another avenue that will be explored in terms of filling in the gaps and all the severed relationships, all the diplomatic relationships that have been severed in this process that's been unfolding throughout this week, perhaps can be replaced. I guess it's too early to tell, but I guess in the coming weeks we'll be able to analyze this further. But that's my analysis in that regards.
Are we heading to a period where every country that deals with Russia is going to pay the price, just like they are warning China? What about the traditional allies? What about these weak African countries that cannot even defend themselves? And they are witnessing pressure from either the West, USA, asking them to pump energy products, above their capacity, just to try to compensate for this, let's say, alternative for Russian energy products. And at the same time, how do you see this in general?
Well, I guess that's the dynamics of multilateral forums, such as the United Nations, when all the players come to the table and have these discussions. But let me remind our viewers that at the end of the day, every state, every actor, every country is going to act in their own interest. And whilst there are several allies with Russia, and I know this week, President Zelensky, made a bold request to President Biden, state Russia as a state of terrorism, And
Yes. So technically, we see this continued demonizing process. I would like to give a final word to Mr. James Dolcey, since we're running out of time. Mr. James Dolcey, how do you see this? Like briefly, are we going to see a new non-aligned countries or movement anytime soon? Because we see poor countries being pressured by both sides.
I don't think we're going to see a new non-aligned movement, and I'm not sure that a new non-aligned movement would be that much of a success. I also, if I can differ with Frederica for a moment, the numbers are correct indeed in terms of what the voting was in the United Nations General Assembly with regard to suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council. I think one has to be careful in drawing a conclusion that these are all Russian allies. There were a great number of countries who do not want to run the risk of setting a precedent of suspending a country from the Human Rights Council for its human rights record because they themselves have very poor human rights records and have been at times taken to task for that. I think what we are going to see, to come back to your question, is increasingly a bifurcated world. But that's going to be increasingly a world that is bifurcated between the United States and China, rather than between the United States, Europe, and Russia. I think that there's obviously going to be a bifurcation with regard to Russia, but it will be a subset of a much broader bifurcation that's going on.
Thank you so much, Mr. James Dorsey. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, our coverage draws to an end. Thank you, dear guests, for these thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.